In this time period, it was September of 1933, and Céspedes was in Matanzas and Santa Clara after a hurricane devastated the area. In Havana, a coup occurred known as the Sergeant's Revolt. It was headed by figures such as Dr. Ramon Grau, Sergio Carbo, and Sergeant Fulgencio Batista. Ultimately, after Céspedes returned to Havana, he realized what just happened and resigned and literally went to his own house. I'm not really even joking about this. He quite literally went to his own house. Anyways, afterwards, a new government was installed and led by a five-man coalition known as the Pentarchy of 1933. After only 5 days, the Pentarchy gave away to the presidency of Ramon Grau, whose term is known as the 100 Days government. The leader of the revolt, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, became the head of the armed forces and began a long period of influence on Cuban politics. The 100 Days government led by Grau is mainly remembered for left-leaning or progressive reforms, such as the establishment of the 8-hour work day as per Grau's presidential decree, a raise of minimum wage, nationalization of Cuban Electric Company, and granting autonomy to the University of Havana. Despite the government's progressive agenda, the government faced significant political power struggles. On one hand, it was not recognized by the United States government. Secondly, there were still other groups, especially members of the traditional political parties, who wanted to be more inclusive in the government. And finally, while the chief of staff of Fulgencio Batista nominally surrendered the power of the army to the new government, in reality, Batista was having talks behind closed doors and having deals with Sumner Wells and U.S. Ambassador Jefferson Caffery and other political groups and members. Eventually, Batista would force Grau's resignation on the 15th of January, 1934. Grau, however, still maintained significant power throughout the beginning of his presidency, and on one various ranking members of Grau's cabinet, as well as students from the Directorio Estudiantil Universitario, wanted Batista removed or assassinated. This was partly because Batista was holding talks with Sumner Wells and other members of the Cuban opposition regarding a potential change in government, without the knowledge or public sanctioning of Grau's administration. After Grau's resignation, a bunch of interim presidents were appointed in and out, as some choices of presidents were unpopular with the military. Some of these presidents were only in power for maybe a day, a few months, or even 6 hours. Eventually, in 1936, general elections were held after 8 years, and the candidates were Miguel Mariano Gomez and former President Mario Garcia Menocal. Menocal clearly likes to, participate, doesn't he? Gomez would end up defeating former President Menocal and become Cuba's new president. Unfortunately, though, Gomez served as the 7th president of Cuba for just over 8 months in 1936. And compared to other administrations, there was actually, general peace and tranquility in Cuba during Gomez's brief presidency. Overall, though, towards the end of Gomez's presidency, former president of Cuba, Carlos Hevia, claimed that Batista was trying to force a confrontation with Gomez, stating, "A military oligarchy has ruled Cuba for 2 years." Ultimately, it was said he wanted to destroy Gomez by showing up so that he will have to resign even if he didn't want to. So, in a little bit of a shocker, truly the one who's been controlling Cuba and the other presidents coming in and out was Fulgencio Batista. Since 1933, Batista engineered the impeachment of Gomez in December 1936 for having vetoed a bill to create rural schools under army control. Hence why Gomez didn't last as president. Power was then given to the vice president under Gomez, known as Federico Laredo Bru, who finished the concluding years of Gomez's term. Finally, the man who had been in power in secret the entire time decided to finally let his ambition all out. Fulgencio Batista was elected president in the 1940 general elections, defeating former president Ramon Grau. You would think that the Cuban people would be so unsupportive of Batista for causing so much political chaos, but surprisingly, he was popular for his advocacy of strengthening labor laws and his support for labor unions. Batista would later instate the 1940 Constitution of Cuba, and during his term in office, Batista carried out major social reforms and established numerous economic regulations and pro-union policies, and served until 1944. After finishing his term, Batista moved to Florida. Yes, that's right. He just moved to Florida. What a man. In 1944, another election was held where former President Ramon Grau again would run for president and face off against Carlos Saladriga Sayas, Batista's handpicked successor, by the way, and would end up somehow winning the election, meaning Ramon Grau became Cuba's 14th president as well. So another title for him in the books, I guess. Despite his initial popularity in 1933, accusations of corruption tainted his administration's image, and a sizable number of Cubans began to distrust him immediately, which is kind of hilarious as he was literally elected. But anyways, As Grau assumed the presidency, he was forced to address many financial problems left by his predecessor, Batista. But honestly, his second term in office was kind of nothing special. He finished his term in 1948 and new elections were held in that year. And four new candidates were fighting for the presidency in Cuba. And ultimately, a new figure would win the presidency. He was Carlos Brillo Socaraz. He was formerly senator of the province of Pinar del Rio and was a member of the Authentic Party of Cuba. Unfortunately for Brillo, his presidency was marked by continuous violence and corruption, and a lot of pressure was put on the poor guy after going through his last few months of being president. New elections were scheduled for the middle of 1952, and rumors surfaced around the nation of a planned military coup by the Giga Chad of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. But Brillo, saying no constitutional basis to act, did not do anything actually. The rumors proved to actually be true, unfortunately for him, and on the 10th of March 1952, Batista and his collaborators seized the military and police commands throughout the country and occupied major radio and TV stations. And then suddenly, Batista assumed power when Brillo, failing to mount a resistance, boarded a plane and went into exile. Batista now was officially dictator of Cuba. Brillo would actually later comment on his presidency, stating, "They say that I was a terrible president. That may be true, but I was the best president Cuba has ever had." And honestly, his statement might be true, as he did less damage politically and socially than any other president in Cuba's history. Anyways, Batista was now truly unstoppable. The US even recognized his government, and upon seizing power, Batista inherited a thriving Cuba for a Latin American nation. Cuba was one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and Havana was described to be the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. Immigrants from Europe were populating the country, and Cuba's economy was even stronger than Japan's and Italy's, which is incredible to say for the time period. Though things weren't exactly perfect, as you can see. One-third of Cuba was under extreme poverty, and a lot of inequality and corruption was widespread. Under Batista, Cuban industrial workers' wages rose significantly, which was great, but yet again, this only benefited certain individuals. Throughout the 1950s, Havana served as a playground for the world's elite, producing sizable gambling, prostitution, and drug profits for the American mafia. Corrupt law enforcement officials and their politically elected cronies under Batista's regime also played a big role in all of this. Even though things weren't necessarily great or perfect in Cuba, Cuba was still booming, at least in an economical and societal manner. But of course, the youth in Cuba were extremely discontent with what they were noticing with the regime. They were also aware of how great life was in Cuba, but they were also aware that with the regime and the crazy circus that Havana was in, change had to come at some point. In July 26, 1953, just over a year after Batista's seizure of power, in Santiago de Cuba, a small group of revolutionaries that were against the regime of Batista attacked the Moncada barracks. This attack was led by a man known as Fidel Castro. Castro had been a student at the University of Havana and studied law. He became embroiled in the student protest movements under the regimes of Cuban presidents. Castro in this time also became heavily opposed to U.S. intervention in Cuba, even though there was a point in his life where he just had a crush on the United States. Young love. Anyways, after Castro led his attack, he was arrested, along with his brother, who was just such a loser. I mean, look at this guy. After the Castro brothers' arrest, the people demanded Batista's regime to release the brothers, and eventually, that year, the Cuban Congress passed a bill granting a general amnesty to political prisoners. After the bill was signed by Batista, the rebels who were captured along with the Castro brothers were freed, which honestly was kind of a crazy move considering what events would occur next. After being freed, the Castro brothers left Cuba and went on to go to Mexico City, where they would meet Che Guevara, an Argentine Marxist and doctor who strongly believed that imperialism and capitalism was destroying millions of people's lives in Latin America. Che Guevara would later become good friends with Raul Castro after meeting him as one of his patients in a nearby hospital, and eventually Fidel would meet him as well. And the three would get a bunch of Cubans, buy a boat, and sail to the Sierra Maestra in eastern Cuba to finally see the fall of Batista. And when they got there, they got absolutely massacred. Only a few of them had survived, and luckily for Castro, he was lucky to have people around him that were ambitious and also extremely popular with the people. Figures like Camilo Cienfuegos, Uber Matos, and others were so popular that Castro was sometimes put to the side, which hurt his ego pretty badly. And anyways, while Castro and his amigos were out there in the mountains, in Havana there was a different faction that was trying to take out Batista, known as the Student Revolutionary Directorate. They were anti-communist and also absolutely hated Batista, so much in fact that they stormed the presidential palace to try to assassinate him. The leader of this faction, known as Jose Antonio Echeverria, was killed in a shootout against Batista's forces, and overall, the whole thing was just a major failure. Other minor rebellions would also occur in this time, but none of them were truly successful. At some point in 1958, even the US stopped supporting Batista, and even gave Castro and his group, known as the 26th of July movement, no less than $50,000, with the purpose being to instill sympathies to the United States amongst the rebels in case the movement succeeded. Even in American fall, his name was William Alexander Morgan, who decided to join the fight against Batista to bring freedom to Cuba, as liberty was something that Morgan truly admired and believed in. Batista later on in the summer of 1958 would establish Operation Verano, where he sent 12,000 soldiers to the mountains to finally end the rebellion. Unfortunately for Batista, half of the soldiers were untrained recruits and were easily defeated by Castro's forces. Even though they were extremely outnumbered, however, tide nearly turned on the 29th of July 1958. Batista's troops almost destroyed Castro's small army of some about 300 men at the Battle of Las Mercedes. Here Fidel got worried and asked for a ceasefire on the 1st of August. And for some reason, they gave it to him. This allowed his forces to escape to the mountains once again. After a while, Castro's forces would strike back as they got more and more support from citizens from the area, to the point that the rebel forces were able to reach Yaguayay. Castro was still busy in the eastern part of Cuba trying to take over small towns. Meanwhile, in the Battle of Yaguayay, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos would take the time to launch an attack against the key city of Santa Clara in the Battle of Yaguayay. Cienfuegos is able to have his column outnumber Batista's forces and absolutely destroy them, making the battle a decisive victory. Meanwhile, Fidel was still having his battle in the Battle of Giza, where his forces were able to capture an army garrison from Batista's army. A month later, Che Guevara with Camilo Cienfuegos would do a massive attack in Santa Clara, defeating the last of Batista's commanding officers and even police. That night, on December 31st, 1958, Fulgencio Batista, after being in power for so long behind the scenes and eventually publicly, saw what was coming. It was over.
Attracts world attention in neighboring Cuba, the former boss of that island takes it easy in the Dominican Republic. These are first films of Fulgencio Batista, the ex-strongman of Cuba, enjoying retirement from public life at Ciudad Trujillo with Ruben, the eldest son of his 8-child family. While Fidel Castro makes headlines in Cuba, Batista lives a plush shadow life nearby.
Batista got on a plane and left Cuba. He took his family and fortune with him and left to the Dominican Republic. After the fall of Santa Clara and the exile of Batista, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and especially Fidel Castro entered Havana in celebration. The Cuban people celebrated the men, and quickly the rebels established a new government. Fidel Castro immediately became Prime Minister of Cuba. It would declare to the world that his revolution was in fact a communist one. Soon the Cuban people had to just realize what just happened. They had just let another dictator in power. After taking power, Fidel wanted to quickly expand his communist ideals elsewhere. It would actually try to invade Panama in a Cuban-led expedition to try to overthrow their government. The expedition would turn out to be a major failure, as the coup was repelled by the Panamanian National Guard. Just a few months later, Cuba would also attempt an invasion of the Dominican Republic as they tried to overthrow the regime of Rafael Trujillo. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Fidel was not the most powerful man in Cuba after taking power, but this was not enough for him. He needed to remove individuals who he saw as a threat to his power and popularity. Many people who worked with him in the revolution, such as Uber Matos, a once revolutionary man dedicated to Castro's cause, denounced the direction of the revolution and would do anti-communist speeches in Camagüey, because for them, Castro had lied. The revolution was meant to be simply a democratic revolution. Instead, Fidel had established a one-party communist regime. When Castro replaced puppet President Manuel Urrutia with the more radical Osvaldo Dorticos, Matos tendered his resignation in a letter to Castro. On the 26th of July, Castro and Matos met at the Hilton Hotel in Havana, where, according to Matos, Castro told him, "Your resignation is not acceptable at this point. We still have too much work to do. I admit that Raul and Che are flirting with Marxism, but you have the situation under control." In September 1959, Matos wrote exactly this: "Communist influence in the government has continued to grow. I have to leave power as soon as possible. I have to alert the Cuban people as to what's happening." On the 19th of October of 1959, he sent a second letter of resignation to Castro. 2 days later, Castro sent revolutionary Camilo Cienfuegos to arrest Matos. Matos quickly told Cienfuegos that his life was in danger and that Castro resented Cienfuegos' popularity and had purposely infiltrated and seemed to have hoped that Cienfuegos would die out of a random circumstance. Cienfuegos listened, but relieved Matos of his command and arrested Matos and his military adjutants. Just 9 days later, on a flight to Havana, a helicopter that had Cienfuegos inside disappeared without a trace. It's widely known and accepted that the Castro brothers had ordered the killing of Cienfuegos, as it was very much confirmed by many individuals such as Matos, that Fidel was simply very, very jealous of the popularity of some figures of the revolution. After Matos was arrested, Cuban exile Pedro Luis Diaz, a former Air Force Chief of Staff under Castro, flew from Florida and dropped leaflets into Havana that called for the removal of all communists from the government. In response, Castro held a rally where he called for the reintroduction of revolutionary tribunals to try Matos and Diaz for treason, even asking the crowd if Matos should be shot. The crowd responded by chanting, "Firing squad," multiple times. Later on, even the American that worked with Castro in the revolution, William Alexander Morgan, was arrested by orders from Castro for apparently having counter-revolutionary activities. A year later, Morgan was unfortunately killed by firing squad. 1 month later, 1,500 CIA-trained exiled Cubans established the military unit Brigade 2506 to invade Cuba and take down the new dictatorship of Fidel Castro. It was almost like if Batista had never left Cuba. The only difference between Batista and Castro was that Batista allowed him more for an authoritarian capitalist regime, while Castro was more happy with an authoritarian socialist regime. Really just a difference in ideology and in brutality. Ultimately, the Bay of Pigs invasion that would later come by was a failure, an embarrassment for the United States, as in the last minute of the attack, the US did not send help in the skies, which in part benefited Castro to get there on time to crush the unit. After the events that unfolded, Castro would bring Cuba to become closer to the Soviet Union, to the point that the next year, in 1962, missiles were found in Cuba, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In this major, almost catastrophic event, Castro truly showed his colors. Castro at this point was open to destroying the United States. Even if Cuba had to get nuked, that was no problem for him. At this point, the leader of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. Even Khrushchev had felt that Castro was literally insane after urging him to just go ahead with the plans to basically start World War III. Ultimately, the United States and the Soviet Union came to an agreement, which made Castro absolutely livid. He accordingly got so angry that he just started breaking and destroying things in his office. Fidel would quickly nationalize most of the industries in Cuba and bring them under state control. Though because of these moves, Castro would lead Cuba to experience economic inefficiency, as state ownership and central planning often resulted in inefficiencies, as bureaucratic decision-making and lack of competition hindered innovation and productivity. Many industries experienced a decline in production and quality of goods and services. After nationalization, Cuba became heavily reliant on economic and military support from the Soviet Union. This dependency increased vulnerability to shifts in global politics, as demonstrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The expropriation of private property and businesses would also occur as a result in a loss of property rights for individuals and corporations, leading to a lack of incentives for entrepreneurship and investment. Castro would relatively improve education, healthcare, which is something that is usually brought up when it comes to Castro's good deeds. The problem is that even though the literacy rate got way higher with Castro's regime, like most dictators, Castro would do the skeptical nice guy moves like these to improve his popularity, while simultaneously doing his own modifications on these things to benefit his regime. Education became a means to promote revolutionary values, nationalism, and a sense of unity among Cubans. Children were taught from a very young age to revere Castro and other revolutionary leaders, fostering strong loyalty to the government, and making it seem like the population was always happy and trustful with the regime. US-Cuban relations were basically completely out during and after the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the crisis, the United States implemented the infamous embargo. Here's the thing though with the embargo, it actually doesn't really exist. Today, presently, many people think and believe that Cuba's poverty and economic conditions are because of the US embargo, though that's simply not true. Now, did it affect Cuba originally? Well, yes. Now, I know this is a little bit confusing, but you have to consider that Cuba was once a nation that fueled off of US credit and US involvement for decades. Now, suddenly, the embargo cut the credit off of Cuba. Cuba could still trade with the US, though. One problem that Cuba had that basically pissed off all countries, including the Soviet Union, was that Castro would basically ask for something, and that something could be food, economic aid, cars, etc. Obviously, the other country would expect money back, and instead, Castro would just not pay it back. So when it came to the embargo, the US wanted actual US dollar being used if Cuba bought something. Truly, the economic downturn that Cuba experienced was because of Castro's useless economic plans, and instead of improving Cuba, would end up destroying Cuban society from its once prosperous era. After the events that would unfold in the 60s, Cuba would spend the next few years depending on the Soviet Union for practically everything. And surprisingly enough, Cuba would also focus on still expanding their communist ideals in many countries, especially in Africa. Cuba would also get involved in the Sand War in Algeria, but the war would end up in a stalemate. Cuba would also get involved in the Machucuto raid, which was a battle involving Venezuelan army and National Guard troops fighting Cuban and Venezuelan trained guerrillas. But the rebels would end up losing as their group was literally only just 12 men. Cuba would also get involved in the Congo crisis. Che Guevara would even go directly to the Congo along with 137 soldiers to assist the National Council of Liberation. But ultimately, after many setbacks and unusual circumstances, Cuban forces quickly left the Congo and would focus their next mission on Guinea-Bissau, which was a Portuguese colony. And at this point, they were just trying to get their independence. But the political party that was in charge of trying to get the colony independence was a communist one. And quickly, immense support came from Cuba and also from Guinea until 1970. Surprisingly, Guinea-Bissau would defeat the Portuguese as the war was basically Portugal's Vietnam. And afterwards, Guinea-Bissau would establish a one-party Marxist state. Cuba would then get involved in a war in Yemen and also in the Yom Kippur War against Israel, which resulted in a major defeat. Then one of Cuba's most infamous interventions, which would happen later on, was the Angolan War of Independence and the Angolan Civil War, along with the South African Border War, where Cuban troops fought South African troops in Angola. Ultimately, with Cuban help, Angola would achieve its independence and become a communist nation until 1992. Cuba would also then assist Ethiopia in the Ogden War. As the Derg communist government was in power, the Cuban military would actually be very beneficial for the Ethiopians, as they were killing thousands of Somalis, which led to Ethiopia's victory in the war. And actually, fun fact, to this day, Somalia believes that the Ogden, which is inhabited largely by ethnic Somalis, would be part of Somalia today if it weren't for the Cubans. During this era of Cuban intervention, Castro would spend his sweet time taking more control in Cuba by creating the Defense of the Revolution, also known as the CDR, to monitor and control the Cuban population. Repression and persecution of political dissents, journalists and artists critical of the regime would become widespread, and Castro would also establish forced labor camps for individuals perceived as counter-revolutionaries or undesirables. Many homosexuals in this time period would be sent to these concentration camps, basically. Between 1959 and 1983, about 1.5 to 2 million Cubans left the island, though the number could be way more. There was at least 5 different immigration waves through this time. In the year 1980, Castro told the Cuban people that they could leave Cuba if they wanted to, which led to people leaving Cuba immediately. Unfortunately for Cuba, with Castro always depending on the Soviet Union and failing to properly cooperate with trade and actually advance the economy, Cuba would experience an economic crisis known as the Special Period, which came with the fall of the Soviet Union. Many terrible results would occur. The death rate for elderly people would increase as many necessities were not being met, and many people were starving, unfortunately enough. Actually, since around the 80s through 90s, there was many cases of starvation. Now, this wasn't extreme starvation as Cuba depended on the Russians. And of course, there was many people who could eat meals throughout the day, of course, but there was a good amount of people who also couldn't, as many salaries were not enough to support a family for food. With the terrible conditions that now Cuba was going through, the people wanted to leave badly. In 1994, there was a group of 72 Cubans who attempted to leave Cuba on a tugboat with the intention of reaching the United States and requesting asylum, would end up unfortunately drowning. The day as el Remolcador 13 de Marzo would be a day that would live in infamy, as 41 men, women, and even children would pass away as the Cuban Coast Guard sank the tugboat and refused to rescue them. Just 2 years after the infamous El Remolcador 13 de Marzo, On February 24th, 1996, the Cuban Air Force shot down two unarmed Cessna 337 Skymaster aircraft operated by Hermanos al Rescate, an organization opposed to the Cuban government. They usually dedicated themselves to saving the lives of refugees who were on the rafts, especially after many lives were lost over the years by Cubans who simply wanted to experience freedom. Ultimately, 4 individuals were killed immediately after the shootdown, those being Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales. Their names should not ever be forgotten, as they were brave enough to save their own people.
In 2008,
Castro would step down from power and give his brother Raul Castro the presidency. Castro stepped down as he realized that he was getting really old and he wasn't really in great physical condition anymore to continue to be a malicious killer. Following his retirement, Castro's health deteriorated even more, and finally, in 2016, Fidel Castro would finally pass away. Millions would celebrate the death of the dictator, including myself. Castro was a man who ultimately lied to the masses. He promised from the beginning to save the Cuban people from any type of authoritarianism, and instead, he would absolutely destroy Cuba. Overall, nothing has changed in Cuba. Raul did not really do much except continue the policies of the regime and also become buddies with Barack Obama during Obama's administration. In 2018, Raul himself stepped down, but worked behind the scenes, while a new face would later come to the seat of the regime and would later crack down on the protests against him that he would experience on the July 11th, 2021 protest, which saw the worldwide Cuban diaspora protest the regime. Unfortunately enough, nothing happened, as the regime quelled the protests by arresting thousands and giving some basic products to the Cuban people, just to calm them down, you know? Cuba's history is honestly extremely sad. From going from a colony that sought independence and freedom and would later on fall onto many regimes and especially experience a 60-year-old regime that's still ongoing and would see the collapse of respect and dignity as a society and the collapse of economic prosperity. The question that can only be asked today is, will the regime ever fall? And the only answer right now is, time will tell.